This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock, now continuing with the history of the great American fortunes by Gustavus Myers, written around 1908. He's the forgotten muckraking journalist that you are not supposed to know about. The oligarchs, I don't think they want you to know about what he wrote about, because he exposed them, much more so than even a guy like Upton Sinclair. Gustavus Myers really exposed these people. The people who own the people you foolishly vote for. Yeah, their owners. The real power source. Gustavus Myers exposes them, and this is Chapter 8 of Volume 3. Further aspects of the Vanderbilt fortune. The juggling of railroads and the virtual seizure of coal mines were by no means the only accomplishments of the Vanderbilt family in the years under consideration. Colorless as was the third generation, undistinguished by any marked characteristic, extremely commonplace in its conventions, it yet proved itself a worthy successor of Commodore Vanderbilt. The lessons he had taught of how to appropriate wealth were duly followed by his descendants, and all of the ancestral methods were closely adhered to by the third generation. Whatever might be its pretensions to a certain integrity and to a profound respectability, there was really no difference between its methods and those of the Commodore. Times had changed, that was all. What had once been regarded as outright theft and piracy were now cloaked under high-sounding phrases as quote-unquote corporate extension and quote-unquote high finance, and other catchwords calculated to lull public suspicion and resentment. A refinement of phraseology had set in, and it served its purpose. Concomitantly, while executing the transactions already described, the Vanderbilts of the third generation put through many others, both large and small, which were converted into further heaps of wealth. An enumeration of all of these diverse frauds would necessitate a tiresome presentation. A few examples will suffice. The small frauds were but lesser in relation to the larger. And at this period of the economic development of the country, when immense thefts were being consummated, a fraud had to rise to the dignity of at least $50 million to be regarded a large one. The law, it is true, proscribed any theft involving more than $25 as grand larceny, but it was law applying to the poor only and operative on them exclusively. The inordinately rich were beyond all law, seeing that they could either manufacture it or its interpretation at will. Among the conspicuous, audacious capitalists, the fraud of a few paltry millions shrank to the modesty of a small, cursory, offhand operation. Yet in the aggregate, these petty frauds constituted great results, and for that reason were valued accordingly. An $8 million area confiscated. Such a slight fraud was, for instance, the Vanderbilts' confiscation of an entire section of New York City. In 1887, they decided that they had urgent and particular need for railroad yard purposes of a sweep of streets from 60th Street to 72nd Street along the Hudson River Railroad Division. What if this property had been bought, laid out, and graded by the city at considerable expense? The Vanderbilts resolved to have it and get it for nothing. Under special forms of law dictated by them, they thereupon took it. The method was absurdly easy. Ever compliant to their interests and composed as usual, of men retained by them or responsive to their influences, the legislature of 1887 passed an act compelling the city authorities to close up the required area of streets. Then the city officials, fully as accommodating, turned the property over to the exclusive and practically perpetual use of the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad. With the profusest expressions of regard for the public interests, the railroad officials did not in the slightest demur at signing an agreement with the municipal authorities. In this paper, they pledged themselves to cooperate with the city in conferring upon the Board of Street Openings the right to reopen any of the streets at any time. This agreement was but a decoy for immediate popular effect. No such reopening ordinance was ever passed. The streets remained closed to the public, which, theoretically at least, was left with the title. In fact, the memorandum of the agreement strangely disappeared from the Cooperation Council's office and did not turn up until 20 years later, when it was accidentally and most mysteriously discovered in the Lenox Library. Whence came it to this curious repository? The query remains unanswered. For 17.5 acres of this confiscated land, comprising about 350 city lots, now valued at around $8 million, the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad has not paid a cent in rental or taxes since the Act of 1887 was passed. On the island of Manhattan alone, 70,000 poor families are every year evicted for inability to pay rent. A continuous and horribly tragic event well worth comparing with the preposterous facility with which the great possessing classes everywhere either buy or defy law and confiscate it when it suits them. So cunningly drafted was the Act of 1887 that while New York City was obliged to give the exclusive use of this large stretch of property to the company, yet the title to the property, the empty name, remained vested in the city. This being so, a corporation council complacently decided that the railroad company could not be taxed so long as the city owned the title. Another of what may be called, for purposes of distinction, the numerous small frauds at this time was that foisting upon New York City the cost of replacing the New York Central's masonry viaduct approaches with a fine steel elevated system. This fraud cost the public treasury about $1,200,000, quite a sizable sum, it will be admitted, but one nevertheless of pitiful proportions in comparison with previous and later transactions of the Vanderbilt family. We have seen how, in 1872, Commodore Vanderbilt put through the legislature an act forcing New York City to pay $4 million for improving the railroad's roadway on Park Avenue. His grandsons now repeated his method. In 1892, the United States government was engaged in dredging a ship canal through the Harlem River. The Secretary of War, having jurisdiction of all navigable waters, issued a mandate to the New York Central to raise its bridge to a given height so as to permit the passing under of large vessels. To comply with this order, it was necessary to raise the track structure both north and south of the Harlem River. Had an ordinary citizen, upon receiving an order from the authorities to make improvements or alterations in his property, attempted to compel the city to pay all or any part of the cost, he would have been laughed at or summarily dealt with. The Vanderbilts were not ordinary property holders. Having the power to order legislatures to do their bidding, they now proceeded to imitate their grandfather and compel the city to pay the greater portion of the cost of supplying them with a splendid steel elevated structure. Public taxation to supply private capital. The legislature of 1892 was thoroughly responsive. This was a legislature which was not merely corrupt, but brazenly and frankly so, as was proved by the scandalous openness with which various spoliative measures were rushed through. An act was passed compelling New York City to pay 1/2 of the cost of the projected elevated approaches, up to the sum of $1,600,000. New York City was thus forced to pay $800,000 for constructing that portion south of the Harlem River. If, so the law read on, the cost exceeded the estimate of $800,000, then the New York Central was to pay the difference. Additional provision was made for the compelling of New York City to pay for the building of the section north of the Harlem River. But who did the work of contracting and building, and who determined what the cost was? The railroad company itself. It charged what it pleased for material and work, and had complete control of the dispersing of the appropriations. The city's supervising commissions had, perforce, to accept its arbitrary demands, and lacked all power to question or even scrutinize its reports of expenditures. Apart from the New York Central's officials, no one today knows what the actual cost has been, except as stated by the company. One of the Vanderbilt buds married Harry Payne Whitney, whose father, William C. Whitney, left a large fortune, partly drawn from the Standard Oil Company, and in part from an industrious career of, you guessed it, corruption and theft. The elder Whitney, according to facts revealed in many official investigations and lawsuits, debauched legislatures and common councils into giving him and his associates public franchises for street railways and for other public utilities, and he stole outright tens of millions of dollars in the manipulation of the street railways in various cities. His crimes, and those of his associates, were of such boldness and magnitude that even the cynical business classes were moved to astonishment. Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jr. married a daughter of R.T. Wilson, a multimillionaire whose fortune came to a great extent from the public franchises of Detroit. The initial and continued history of the securing and exploitation of the street railway and other franchises of that city has constituted a solid chapter of the most flagrant fraud. William K. Vanderbilt, Jr. married a daughter of the multimillionaire Senator Fair of California, whose fortune, dug from mines, bought him a seat in the United States Senate. Thus, various multimillionaire fortunes have been interconnected by these American marriages. You think we don't have an aristocracy in America? Think again. Diversity of the Vanderbilt possessions. The fortune of the Vanderbilt family, at this present writing, is represented by the most extensive and different forms of property: railroads, street railways, electric lighting systems, mines, industrial plants, express companies, land, and government, state, and municipal bonds. These are some of the forms. From one industrial plant alone, the Pullman Company, the Vanderbilts draw millions in revenue yearly. Formerly, they owned their own Palace Car Company, the Wagner, but it was merged with the Pullman. The frauds and extortions of the Pullman Company have been sufficiently dealt with in the particular chapter on Marshall Field. In the faraway Philippine Islands, the Vanderbilts are engaged with other magnates in the exploitation of both the United States government and the native population. The Visayan Railroad numbers one of the Vanderbilts among its directors. This railroad has already received a government subsidy of $500,000 in addition to the free gift of a perpetual franchise on the ground that, quote, the railroad was necessary to the development of the archipelago, unquote. Well, there's a nice reason why we took over the Philippine Islands in the Spanish-American War. I never knew that. The Vanderbilts were very quick to exploit and build their exploitative railroad systems there. All right. But the Vanderbilts' principal property consists of the New York Central Railroad system. The Union Pacific Railroad, controlled by the Harriman Standard Oil interests, now owns $14 million of stock in the New York Central system and has directors on the governing board. The probabilities are that the voting power of the New York Central, the Lake Shore, and other Vanderbilt lines is passed into the hands of the Standard Oil interests, of which Harriman was both a part and an ally. This signifies that it is only a question of a short time when all or most of the railroads of the United States will be directed by one all-powerful and all-embracing trust. Monopoly. But this does not by any means denote that the Vanderbilts have been stripped of their wealth. However much they may part with their stock, which gives the voting power, it will be found that, like William H. Vanderbilt, they hold a stupendous amount in railroad and other kinds of bonds. As the Astors and other rich families were perfectly willing, in 1867, to allow Commodore Vanderbilt to assume the management of the New York Central, on the ground that under his bold direction their profits and loot would be greater, so the lackadaisical Vanderbilts of the present generation perhaps likewise looked upon Harriman, who proved his ability to accomplish vast, fraudulent stock-watering operations and consolidations, and to oust lesser magnates. The New York Central, at this writing, still remains a Vanderbilt property, not so distinctly so it was 20 years ago, yet strongly enough under the Vanderbilt domination. According to Moody, this railroad's net income in 1907 was $34 million. In alluringly describing its present and prospective advantages and value, Moody went on, quote, to begin with, it has entry into the heart of New York City, with extensive passenger and freight terminals, all of which are bound to be of steadily increasing worth as the years go by, as New York continues to grow in population and wealth. It has, in addition, a practically water-grade line all the way from New York to Chicago, and therefore, for all time, must necessarily have a great advantage over lines like the Erie, the Lackawanna, and others with heavy grades, many curves, etc. It has a myriad of small feeders and branches in growing and populous parts of the state of New York, as well as in the sections further to the west. It touches the Great Lakes at various points, operates water transportation for freights to all parts of the lakes, enters Chicago over its own tracks, and competes aggressively with the Pennsylvania for all traffic to and from all parts of the Mississippi Valley and the West and Southwest. It is in no danger from disastrous competition in its own chosen territory, therefore, and constantly receives income of vast importance through a network of feeders which penetrate the territory of some of the largest of its rivals." Unquote. The sort of ability displayed. The particular kind of ability by which one man, followed by his descendants, obtained the controlling ownership of this great railroad system and of other properties has been herein adequately set forth. Long has it been the custom to attribute to Commodore Vanderbilt and successive generations of Vanderbilts an almost supernatural, quote-unquote, constructive genius, and to explain by that glib phrase their success in getting hold of their colossal wealth. This explanation is clumsy fiction that at once falls to pieces under historical scrutiny. The moment a genuine investigation is begun into the facts, the glamour of superior ability and respectability evaporates, and the Vanderbilt fortune stands out, like all other fortunes, as the product of a continuous chain of frauds. Boy, does this book ever confirm the biblical view of man. Just as 50 years ago Commodore Vanderbilt was blackmailing his original millions without molestation by law, so today the Vanderbilts are pursuing methods outside the pale of law. Not all of the facts have been given by any means. Only the most important have been included in these chapters. For one thing, no mention has been made of their repeated violations of a law prohibiting the granting of rebates, a law which was stripped of its imprisonment clause by the railroad magnates and made punishable by fine only. Time and time again in recent years has the New York Central been proved guilty in the courts of violating even this emasculated law. From the very inception of the Vanderbilt fortune, the chronicle is the same, and ever the same: legalized theft by purchase of law, and lawlessness by evasion or defiance of law. With fraud it began, by fraud it has been increased and extended and perpetuated, and by fraud it is held. Wow. Gustavus Myers closes out chapter 8 smoking. Right on. He had that last sentence in bold. Okay, folks, chapter 8 was shorter than average, so we are going to take a break and then come back with chapter 9. Okay, we're back. Time for chapter 9 of volume 3 of the History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers, written in 1908. You're not supposed to know this stuff. Cover your ears. The rise of the Gould fortune. The greater part of this commanding fortune was originally heaped up, as was that of Commodore Vanderbilt, in about 15 years, and at approximately the same time. One of the most powerful fortunes in the United States, it now controls, or has exercised a dominant share of the control, over more than 18,000 miles of railway, the total ownership of which is represented by considerably more than $1 billion in stocks and bonds. The Gould fortune is also either openly or covertly paramount in many telegraph, transatlantic cable, mining, land, and industrial corporations. Its precise proportions no one knows except the Gould family itself. That it reaches many hundreds of millions of dollars is fairly obvious, although what is its exact figure is a matter not to be easily ascertained. In the flux of present economic conditions, which, so far as the control of the resources of the United States is concerned, have simmered down to desperate combats between individual magnates or contesting sets of magnates, the proportions of great fortunes, especially those based upon railroads and industries, constantly tend to vary. In the years 1908 and 1909, the Gould fortune, if report be true, was somewhat diminished by the onslaughts of that catapultic railroad baron, E.H. Harriman, who unceremoniously seized a share of the voting control of some of the railroad systems long controlled by the Goulds. Despite this reported loss, the Gould fortune is an active, aggressive, and immense one, vested with the most extensive power and embracing hundreds of millions of dollars in cash, land, palaces, or profit-producing property in the form of bonds and stocks. Its influence and ramifications, like those of the Vanderbilt and other huge fortunes, penetrate directly or indirectly into every inhabited part of the United States and into Mexico and other foreign countries. J. Gould's boyhood. The founder of this fortune was J. Gould, father of the present holding generation. He was the son of a farmer in Delaware County, New York, and was born in 1836. As a child, his lot was to do various chores on his father's farm. In driving the cows, he had to go barefoot perforce by reason of poverty, and often thistles bruised his feet, a trial which seems to have left such a poignant and indelible impression upon his mind that when testifying before a United States Senate investigating committee 40 years later, he pathetically spoke of it with a reminiscent quivering. His father was, indeed, so poor that he could not afford to let him go to public school. This lad, however, made an arrangement with a blacksmith by which he received board in return for certain clerical services. These did not interfere with his attending school. When 15, he became a clerk in a country store, a task which, he related, kept him at work from 6 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock at night. It is further related that by getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning and studying mathematics for 3 years, he learned the rudiments of surveying. According to Gould's own story, an engineer who was making a map of Ulster County hired him as an assistant at, quote, $20 a month and found, unquote. This engagement somehow, we are not informed how, turned out unsatisfactorily. Gould was forced to support himself by making, quote, unquote, noon marks for the farmers. To 2 other young men who had worked with him upon the map of Ulster County, Gould, as narrated by himself, sold his interest for $500, and with this sum as capital, he proceeded to make maps of Albany and Delaware counties. These maps, if we may believe his own statement, he sold for $5,000. he goes into the tanning business. Subsequently, Gould went into the tanning business in Pennsylvania with Zadok Pratt, a New York merchant, politician, and congressman of a certain degree of note at the time. Pratt, it seems, was impressed by young Gould's energy, skill, and smooth talk, and supplied the necessary capital of $120,000. Gould, as the phrase goes, was an excellent bluff, and so dexterously did he manipulate and hoodwink the old man that it was quite some time before Pratt realized what was being done. Finally, becoming suspicious of where the profits from the Gouldsboro Tannery, named after Gould, were going, Pratt determined upon some overhauling and investigating. Gould was alert in forestalling this move. During his visits to New York City, he had become acquainted with Charles M. Loop, a rich leather merchant. Gould prevailed upon Loop to buy out Pratt's interest. When Gould returned to the tannery, he found that Pratt had been analyzing the ledger. A scene followed, and Pratt demanded that Gould buy or sell the plant. Gould was ready and offered him $60,000, which was accepted. Immediately, Gould drew upon Loop the money. Loop likewise became suspicious after a time, and from the ascertained facts, had the best of grounds for becoming so. The sequel was a tragic one. One night, in the panic of 1857, Loop shot and killed himself in his fine mansion at Madison Avenue and 25th Street. His suicide caused a considerable stir in New York City. He buys railroad bonds with his stealings. 3 years later, in 1860, Gould set up as a leather merchant in New York City. The New York Directory for that year contains this entry, quote, J. Gould, leather merchant, 39 Spruce Street, House, Newark, unquote. For several years after this, his name did not appear in the directory. He had been, however, edging his way into the railroad business with the sums he had stolen from Pratt and Loop. At the very time that Loop committed suicide, Gould was buying the first mortgage bonds of the Rutland and Washington Railroad, a small line, 62 miles long, running from Troy, New York to Rutland, Vermont. These bonds, which he purchased for 10 cents on the dollar, gave him control of this bankrupt railroad. He hired men of managerial ability, had them improve the railroad, and he then consolidated it with other small railroads, the stock of which he had bought in. With the passing of the panic of 1857, and with the incoming of the stupendous corruption of the Civil War period, Gould was able to manipulate his bonds and stock until they reached a high figure. With a part of his profits from his speculation in the bonds of the Rutland and Washington Railroad, he bought enough stock of the Cleveland and Pittsburgh Railroad to give him control of that line. This he manipulated until its price greatly rose when he sold the line to the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. In these transactions there were tortuous substrata of methods, of which little today can be learned, except for the most part what Gould himself testified to in 1883, which testimony he took pains to make as favorable to his past as possible. His career from 1867 onwards stood out in the fullest prominence. A multitude of official reports and investigations and court records contribute a translucent record. He became invested with a sinister distinction as the most cold-blooded corruptionist, spoliator, and financial pirate of his time. And so thoroughly did he earn this reputation that to the end of his days it confronted him at every step, and survived to become the standing reproach and terror of his descendants. For nearly a half-century, the very name of Jay Gould has been a persisting jeer and byword, an object of popular contumely and hatred, and the signification of every foul and base crime by which greed triumphs. Why this biased view of Gould's career? Yet it may be well asked now, even if for the first time, why has Jay Gould been plucked out as a special object of opprobrium? What curious, erratic, unstable judgment is this that selects this one man as the scapegoat of commercial society, while deferentially allowing his business contemporaries the fullest measure of integrity and respectability? Monotonous echoes of one another, devoid of understanding, writer has followed writer in harping undiscriminatingly upon Jay Gould's crimes. His career has been presented in the most forbidding colors, and in order to show that he was an abnormal exception and not a familiar type, his methods have been darkly contrasted with those of such illustrious capitalists as the Astors, the Vanderbilts, and others. Thus has the misinformed thing called public opinion been shaped by these scribbling purveyors of fables. I like that phrase. You guys, whenever you go into Barnes & Noble or Borders Books or Walden Books, whatever, and then when you buy any book, mainstream book written by a quote-unquote historian or contemporary event author, you are buying something written by a scribbling purveyor of fables. Wow, that's good writing. Back to the book. And this public opinion has been taught to look upon Jay Gould's career as an exotic, quote-unquote, horrible example, having nothing in common with the careers of other founders of large fortunes. The same generation, habitually addicted to the cursing of the memory of Jay Gould and the taunting of his children and grandchildren with the reminders of his thefts, speaks with traditional respect of the wealth of such families as the Astors and the Vanderbilts. Yet the cold truth is, as has been copiously proved, John Jacob Astor was proportionately as notorious a swindler in his day as Gould was in his. And as for Commodore Vanderbilt, he had already made blackmailing on a large scale a safe art before Gould was out of his teens. Gould has been impeached as one of the most audacious and successful buccaneers of modern times. Without doubt he was so, a freebooter who, if he could not appropriate millions, would filch thousands. A pitiless human carnivore, glutting on the blood of his numberless victims. A gambler destitute of the usual gambler's code of fairness in abiding by the rules. An incarnate fiend of a Machiavelli in his calculations, his schemes and ambushes, his plots and counterplots. But it was only in degree, and not at all in kind, that he differed from the general run of successful wealth builders. The Vanderbilts committed thefts of as great an enormity as he, but they gradually managed to weave around themselves an exterior of protective respectability. All sections of the capitalist class, in so fiercely reviling Gould, reminded one of the thief who, to divert attention from himself, joins with the pursuing crowd in loudly shouting, quote-unquote, "Stop thief!" We shall presently see whether this comparison is an exaggerated one or not. The teachings of his environment. To understand the incentives and methods of Gould's career, it is necessary to know the endemic environment in which he grew up and flourished, and its standards and spirit. He, like others of his stamp, were, in a great measure, but products of the times. And it is not the man so much as the times that are of paramount interest, for it is they which supply the explanatory key. In preceding chapters, repeated insights have been given into the methods not merely of one phase, but of all phases of capitalist formulas and processes. At the outset, however, in order to approach impartially this narrative of the Gould fortune, and to get a clear perception of the dominant forces of his generation, a further presentation of the business class methods of that day will be given. As a young man, what did Jay Gould see? He saw, in the first place, that society, as it was organized, had neither patience nor compassion for the very poverty its grotesque system created. Prate its higher classes might of the blessings of poverty, and they might spread broadcast their prolix homilies on the virtues of a useful life, quote, rounded by an honorable poverty, unquote. But all of these teachings were, in one sense, chatter and nonsense. The very classes which so unctuously preached them were those who most strained themselves to acquire all of the wealth that they possibly could. In another sense, these teachings proved an effective agency in the infusing into the minds of the masses of established habits of thought calculated to render them easy and unresisting victims to the rapacity of their despoilers. From these quote-unquote upper classes proceeded the dictation of laws, and the laws showed, as they do now, what the real unvarnished attitude of these fine, exhorting moralists was towards the poor. Poverty was virtually prescribed as a crime. The impoverished were regarded in law as paupers, and so repugnant a term of odium was that of pauper, so humiliating its significance and treatment, that great numbers of the destitute preferred to suffer and die in want and silence rather than avail themselves of the scanty and mortifying public aid obtainable only by acknowledging themselves as paupers. Sickness, disability, old age, and even normal life in poverty were a terrifying prospect. The one sure way of escaping it was to get hold of great wealth and hang on to it. The only guarantee of security was wealth, provided its possessor could keep it intact against the maraudings of his own class. Every influence conspired to drive men into making desperate attempts to break away from the stigma and thraldom of poverty and gain economic independence and social prestige by the ownership of wealth. But how was this wealth to be obtained? Here, another set of influences combined with the first set to suppress or shatter whatever doubts, reluctance, or scruples the aspirant might have. The acquisitive young man soon saw that toiling for the profit of others brought nothing but poverty to himself. Perhaps at the most some small savings that were constantly endangered. To get wealth, he must not only exploit his fellow men, he found, but he must not be squeamish in his methods. This lesson was powerfully and energetically taught on every hand by the whole capitalist class. Conventional writers have descanted with a show of great indignation upon Gould's bribing of legislative bodies and upon his cheatings and swindlings, without adverting again to the corruption, reaching far back into the centuries, existing before his time. We shall simply describe some of the conditions that, as a young man, he witnessed, or which were prevalent, synchronously with his youth. Whatever sphere of business was investigated, there it was at once discovered that wealth was being amassed, not only by fraudulent methods, but by methods often a positive peril to human life itself. Whether large or small trader, these methods were the same, varying only in degree. All business reeked with fraud. A congressional committee probing in 1847 to 1848 into frauds in the sale of drugs found that there was scarcely a wholesale or retail druggist who was not consciously selling spurious drugs which were a menace to human life. That has not changed. Wow. That went on over a century ago? Dr. M.J. Bailey, United States Examiner of Drugs at the New York Custom House, was one of the many expert witnesses who testified. Quote, more than one half of many of the most important chemical and medicinal preparations, unquote, Dr. Bailey stated, quote, together with large quantities of crude drugs come to us so much adulterated as to render them not only worthless as a medicine, but often dangerous, unquote. These drugs were sold throughout the United States at high prices. There is not a single record of any criminal action pressed against those who profited from selling this poisonous stuff. Of course not. Are any of the vaccinators being thrown in jail nowadays, or even paying fines, when they give children autism? No. No, they are actually, they're immune from prosecution. The manufacture and sale of patent medicines were attended with the grossest frauds. At that time, to a much greater extent than now, the newspapers profited more, comparatively, from the publication of patent medicine advertisements. And even after a congressional committee had fully investigated and exposed the nature of these nostrums, the newspapers continued publishing the alluring and fraudulent advertisements. After showing at great length the deceptive and dangerous ingredients used in a large number of patent medicines, the Committee on the Judiciary of the House of Representatives went on In its report of February 6, 1849, quote, "The public prints, without exception, published these promises and commendations. The annual advertising fee for publishing Brandeth's pills has amounted to $100,000. Morrison paid more than twice as much for the advertisement of his never-dying hygiene," unquote. The committee described how Morrison's nostrums often contained powerful poisons, and then continued, quote, "Morrison is forgotten, and Brandeth is on the high road to the same distinction. T.W. Conway, from the lowest obscurity, became worth millions from the sale of his nostrums, and rode in triumph through the streets of Boston in his coach and six. A stable boy in New York was enrolled among the wealthiest in Philadelphia by the sale of a panacea which contains both mercury and arsenic." like the vaccinations today. "Innumerable similar cases can be adduced," unquote. "Not a few multi-millionaire families of today derive their wealth from the enormous profits made by their fathers and grandfathers from the manufacture and sale of these poisonous medicines. Can you say Rockefeller?" Success as Gould learned it. The frauds among merchants and manufacturers reached far more comprehensive and permeating proportions. In periods of peace, these fraudulent methods were nauseating enough. But in times of war, they were inexpressibly repellent and ghastly. During the Mexican War, the northern shoe manufacturers dumped upon the army shoes which were of so inferior a make that they could not be sold in the private market. And these shoes were found to be so absolutely worthless that it is on record that the American army in Mexico threw them away upon the sands in disgust. But it was during the Civil War that northern capitalists of every kind coined fortunes from the national disasters and from the blood of the very armies fighting for their interests. Interesting, I'm about a quarter way through of the book Kill Zone by Colonel Craig Roberts. And I'm at the point where Roberts is documenting the corporations that provided the munitions and equipment for our soldiers in Vietnam, and how these corporations didn't have to do any bidding, kind of like the Halliburton thing with Iraq today. These corporations, such as Colt Firearms, who provided the M16, and the Bell Helicopter Corporation, which provided the Huey helicopter, they didn't have to do any bidding. They had established a monopoly through connections, through, of course, the Dulles brothers and other insiders. And so they basically, their equipment was crap. The M16, as Roberts documents, was atrocious and would fall apart, it would get jammed, and was greatly inferior at that time to the AK-47 the enemy had, the Viet Cong. Records Colonel Craig Roberts, and a lot of men died. A lot of our men died because of their M16 jammed up in the heat of battle. Maybe they changed, and maybe they perfected the M16 later on, but the fact is, because those companies didn't have to compete, they sold crap to our men whose lives were on the line. Nice. Well, this was hardly anything new, though. Corporations in America, insider corporations, have always, during times of war, looks like they establish a monopoly. They don't have to compete with any other corporations, and our soldiers get inferior weaponry, inferior shoes that fall apart, and guns that get jammed, helicopters that are underpowered, and our men die. Blood is on the hands of these oligarchs everywhere. Tell me Jesus is not going to hold these these men accountable, these elite men. Okay, back to the book. In the chapters on the Vanderbilt fortune, it has been shown how Commodore Vanderbilt and other shipping merchants fraudulently sold or leased to the government for exorbitant sums ships for the transportation of soldiers, ships so decayed or otherwise unseaworthy that they had to be condemned. In those chapters, such facts were given as applied mainly to Vanderbilt. In truth, however, they constituted but a mere part of the gory narrative. While Vanderbilt, as the government agent, was leasing or buying rotten ships and making millions of dollars in loot by collusion, the most conspicuous and respectable shipping merchants of the time were unloading their old hulks upon the government at extortionate prices. One of the most ultra-respectable merchants of the time, ranked of high commercial standing and austere social prestige, was, for instance, Marshall O. Roberts. This was the identical Roberts so deeply involved in the great mail subsidy frauds. This was also the same sanctimonious Roberts who, as has been brought out in the chapters on the Astor fortune, joined with John Jacob Astor and others in signing a testimonial certifying to the honesty of the Tweed regime. A select congressional committee inquiring into government contracts in 1862 to 1863 brought forth volumes of facts that amazed and sickened a committee accustomed to ordinary political corruption. Here is a sample of the testimony. Samuel Churchman, a government vessel expert engaged by Wells, Secretary of the Navy, told in detail how Roberts and other merchants and capitalists had contrived to palm off rotten ships on the government. And in his further examination on January 3rd, 1863, Churchman was asked, quote, question, did Roberts sell or charter any other boats to the government? Answer, yes, sir. He sold the Winfield Scott and the Union to the government. Question, for how much? Answer, $100,000 each, and one was totally lost, and the other condemned a few days after they went to sea, unquote. In the course of later inquiries in the same examination, Churchman testified that the government had been cheated out of at least $25 million in the chartering and purchase of vessels, and that he based his judgment upon, quote, the chartered and purchased vessels I am acquainted with, and the enormous sums wasted there to my certain knowledge, unquote. This $25 million swindle from the government in that one item of ships alone formed the basis of many a present plutocratic fortune. Fraud underlies respectability. But this was not by any means the only schooling Gould received from the respectable business element. It can be said advisedly that there was not a single avenue of business in which the most shameless frauds were not committed upon both the government and the people. The importers and manufacturers of arms scoured Europe to buy up worthless arms, and then cheated the government out of millions of dollars in supplying those guns and other ordnance, all notoriously unfit for use. Reported a congressional commission in 1862, quote, a large proportion of our troops are armed with guns of very inferior quality, and tens of thousands of the refuse arms of Europe are at this moment in our arsenals, and thousands more are still to arrive, all unfit, unquote. Same old story. A congressional committee appointed in 1862 to inquire into the connection between government employees on the one hand and banks and contractors on the other, established the fact conclusively that the contractors regularly bribed government inspectors in order to have their spurious wares accepted. In fact, the ramifications of the prevalent frauds were so extensive that a number of congressional committees had to be appointed at the same time to carry on an adequate investigation. And even after long inquiries, it was admitted that but the surface had been scratched. During the Civil War, prominent merchants with eloquent outbursts of patriotism formed Union defense committees in various northern cities and solicited contributions of money and commodities to carry on the war. It was disclosed before the congressional investigating committees that not only did the leading members of these Union defense committees turn their patriotism to thrifty account in getting contracts, but that they engaged in great swindles upon the government in the process. Thus, Marcellus Hartley, a conspicuous dealer in military goods and the founder of a multi-millionaire fortune, admitted that he had sold a large consignment of Hall's carbines to a member of the New York Union Defense Committee. In a sudden burst of contrition, he went on, quote, "I think the worst thing this government has been swindled upon has been these confounded Hall's carbines, that they have been elevated in price to $22.50, I think," unquote. He could have accurately added that these carbines were absolutely dangerous. It was found that their mechanism was so faulty that they would shoot off the thumbs of the very soldiers using them. Hartley was one of the importers who brought over the refuse arms of Europe and sold them to the government at extortionate prices. He owned up to having contracts with various of the states, as distinguished from the national government, for $600,000 worth of these worthless arms. That coruscating patriot and philanthropic multimillionaire of these present times, J. Pierpont Morgan, was, as we shall see, profiting during the Civil War from the sale of Hall's carbines to the government. One of the congressional committees investigating contracts for other Army material and provisions found the fullest evidences of gigantic frauds. Exorbitant prices were extorted for tents, quote-unquote, which were valueless. These tents, it appeared, were made from cheap or old, quote-unquote, farmer's drill, regarded by the trade as, quote-unquote, truck. Soldiers testified that they, quote, could better keep dry out of them than under them, unquote. Great frauds were perpetrated in passing goods into the arsenals. One manufacturer in particular, Charles C. Roberts, was awarded a contract for 50,000 haversacks and 50,000 knapsacks. An expert testified, quote, "Every one of these was a fraud upon the government, for they were not linen, they were shoddy," unquote. A congressional committee found that the provisions supplied by the contractors were either deleterious or useless. Captain Beckwith, a commissary of subsistence, testified that the coffee was, quote, "absolutely good for nothing and is worthless. It is of no use to the government," unquote. Quote, question, "Is the coffee at all merchantable?" Answer, "It is not." Question, Describe that coffee as nearly as you can. Answer. It seems to be a compound of roasted peas, of licorice, and a variety of other substances with just enough coffee to give it a taste and aroma of coffee, unquote. This committee extracted much further evidence showing how all other varieties of provisions were of the very worst quality and how, quote, rotten and condemned blankets, unquote, in enormous quantities were passed into the army by bribing the inspectors. It disclosed at great length how the railroads, in their schedule of freight rates, were extorting from the government 50% more than from private parties. Don Cameron, leader of the corrupt Pennsylvania political machine and a railroad manipulator, was at that time Secretary of War. Whom did he appoint as the supreme official in charge of railroad transportation? None other than Thomas A. Scott, the vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Scott, it may be said, was another capitalist whose work has so often been fulsomely described as being that of, quote, a remarkable constructive ability, unquote. The ability he displayed during the Civil War was unmistakable. With his collusion, the railroads extorted right and left. The committee described how the profits of the railroads, after his appointment, rose fully 50% in 1 year, and how quartermasters and others were bribed to obtain the transportation of regiments. Stated the committee, quote, this illustrates the immense and unnecessary profits which was spirited from the government and secured to the railroads by the schedule fixed by the vice president of the Pennsylvania Central under the auspices of Mr. Cameron, unquote. These many millions of dollars extorted in frauds, reported the committee, quote, came out of the impoverished and depleted treasury of the United States at a time when her every energy and resources were taxed to the utmost to maintain the war, unquote. These are but a few facts of the glaring fraud and corruption prevailing in every line of mercantile and financial business. Great and audacious as Gould's thefts were later, they could not be put on the same indescribably low plane as those committed during the Civil War by men, most of whom succeeded in becoming noted for their fine respectability and quote-unquote solid fortunes. So many momentous events were taking place during the Civil War that, amid all the preparations, the battles, and excitement, those frauds did not arouse that general gravity of public attention which, at any other time, would have inevitably resulted. Consequently, the men who perpetrated them contrived to hide under cover of the more absorbing great events of those years. Gould committed his thefts at a period when the public had little else to preoccupy its attention. Hence they loomed up in the popular mind as correspondingly large and important. A specimen of Gould's tuition. At the very dawn of his career in 1857, as a railroad owner, Gould had the opportunity of securing valuable and gratuitous instruction in the ways by which railroad projects and land grants were being bribed through Congress. He was then only 21 years old ready to learn, but, of course, without experience in dealing with legislative bodies. But the older capitalists, veterans at bribing, who for years had been corrupting Congress and the legislatures, supplied him with the necessary information. Not voluntarily did they do it. Their greatest ally was concealment. But one crowd of them had too baldly bribed Congress to vote for an act giving an enormous land grant in Iowa, Minnesota, and other states to the Des Moines Navigation and Railroad Company. The facts unearthed must have been a lasting lesson to Gould as to how things were done in the exalted halls of Congress. The charges made an ugly stir throughout the United States, and the House of Representatives, in self-defense, had to appoint a special committee to investigate itself. This committee made a remarkable and unusual report. Ordinarily, in charges of corruption, investigating committees were accustomed to reporting innocently that while it might have been true that corruption was used, yet they could find no evidence that members had received bribes. Almost invariably, such committees put the blame and the full measure of their futile excoriations on, quote, the iniquitous lobbyists, unquote. But this particular committee, surprisingly enough, handed in no such flaccid, whitewashing report. It found conclusively that corrupt combinations of members of Congress did exist, and it recommended the expulsion of 4 members whom it decreed guilty of receiving either money or land in exchange for their votes. One of these 4 expelled members, Erasmus B. Mattison, it appeared, was a leader of a corrupt combination. The committee branded him as having arranged with the railroad capitalists to use, quote, a large sum of money, $100,000, and other valuable considerations corruptly, unquote. But it was essentially during the Civil War that Gould received his completest tuition in the great art of seizing property and privileges by bribing legislative bodies. While many sections of the capitalist class were, as we have seen, swindling manifold hundreds of millions of dollars from a hard-pressed country and reaping fortunes by exploiting the lives of the very defenders of their interests, other sections, equally mouthy with patriotism, were sneaking through Congress and the legislatures, act after act, further legalizing stupendous thefts. Patriotism at 50%. Some of these acts, demanded by the banking interests, made the people of the United States pay an almost unbelievable usurious interest for loans. These banking statutes were so worded that nominally the interest did not appear high. In reality, however, by various devices, the bankers, both national and international, were often able to extort from 20 to 50 and often 100% in interest, and this on money which had at some time or somehow been squeezed out of exploited peoples in the United States or elsewhere. By these laws, the bankers were allowed to get an annual payment from the government of 6% interest in gold on the government bonds that they bought. They could then deposit those same bonds with the government and issue their own banknotes against 90% of the bonds deposited. They drew interest from the government on the deposited bonds, and at the time charged borrowers an exorbitant rate of interest for the use of the banknotes, which passed as currency. It was by this system of double interest that they were able to sweep into their coffers hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars, not a dollar of which did they earn, and all of which were sweated out of the adversities of the people of the United States. From 1863 to 1878 alone, the government paid out to national banks as interest on bonds the enormous sum of $252,837,556.77. On the other hand, the banks were entirely relieved from paying taxes. They secured the passage of a law exempting government bonds from taxation. Armies were being slaughtered and legions of homes desolated, but it was a rich and safe time for the bankers. A very common occurrence was it for banks to declare dividends of 20, 40, and sometimes 100%. It was also during the stress of this Civil War period when the working and professional population of the nation was fighting on the battlefield or being taxed heavily to support their brothers in arms, that the capitalists, who later turned up as owners of various Pacific Railroad lines, were bribing through Congress acts giving them the most comprehensive, perpetual privileges and great grants of money and of land. Gould saw how all of the others of the wealth seekers were getting their fortunes, and the methods that he now plunged into use were but in keeping with theirs. A little bolder and more brutally frank, perhaps, but nevertheless nothing more than a repetition of what had been going on in the entire sphere of capitalism. Okay, folks. You've been listening to Chapters 8 and 9 of The History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. I'm Gordon Comstock. This is the Ministry of Truth.